I bet you didn't know about lobotomies. The operation known as lobotomy was developed by a Portuguese neurologist, Antonia Moniz, for which he was rewarded a Nobel Prize, despite the procedure's highly controversial nature. During the late 1940s through 1950s, the results of this procedure were inconsistent. Some patients died during the procedure, some shortly after from complications from the surgery, and others later by suicide. Prior lobotomies required a portion of the skull to be removed. It was called a pre-frontal lobotomy. Portuguese neurologist Antonia Moniz performed his first lobotomy in 1935, drilling holes into a patient's skull, kind of like this. Pouring alcohol into the frontal cortex to sever nerves, then coring sections of the brain with hollow needles. That's brutal. Dr. Freeman developed what he called an improved procedure, which was called a transorbital lobotomy, which was performed with a surgical tool that resembled an ice pick. The most brutal, barbaric, and infamous medical procedure of all time. An ice pick hammered into your eye sockets, and then into the brain where it was wiggled around, destroying the frontal lobe. And it would often leave patients in a vegetative state. Dr. Freeman was the one who really popularized the procedure. He started traveling around the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile. The Lobotomobile. That would have been pretty sick for Twisted Metal. Where he was performing up to 12 ice pick lobotomies a day, all of them in 12 minutes or less. His highest count, 25 lobotomies in one single day. Dr. Freeman was also known as a showman. He would like to perform lobotomies in front of a crowd, sometimes doing double ice picks in both eyes simultaneously, while using a carpenter's hammer. Writer Dorothy Parker once said, "I would rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." But still, the popularity of lobotomy soared like wildfire, with thousands of people being subjected to the 10-minute procedure. One of the biggest tragedies of lobotomies? People were kept in the dark about the horrific consequences. They claimed the lobotomy was this wonderful procedure that could cure all ailments. It wasn't uncommon for them to show before and after pictures. They would show a picture of someone in a manic state, and then clip over to a picture of someone looking calm, possibly even smiling. Few people realize that in the after picture, the patient was more zombie than human. And I don't mean zombies like that. I mean zombies like this. Years later, the ice pick lobotomy was known as a procedure that turned lunatics into idiots. At the time lobotomies were most popular, from the mid-1930s to the 1950s. Mental illness was a dreadful stigma for families. But unless you sent your relative to a mental institution, there were few other options. Antipsychotics and antidepressants weren't even introduced clinically until the 1970s. Here we had 3 women who famously received lobotomies. I think it's important to note that most lobotomies were performed on women. Eva Perón. She was the wife of Argentine President Juan Perón. She was made internationally famous from the film and play Evita. She died when she was only 33 years old in July of 1952 of cancer. When she met her husband Juan, she was only 24, which was roughly half his age, and by that time had shown little to no interest in politics at all whatsoever. She was an actress and a performer with jet black hair. That she dyed blonde. And after a few film roles, she performed in radio plays. After meeting Juan and becoming his lover, she began performing in a radio drama, which bragged on the achievements of Juan and helped his popularity grow. In 1945, Eva and Juan were officially married. And in 1946, Juan was elected president. And suddenly, Eva found herself dabbling in politics as well. She ended up developing many political positions, which were dangerous to her husband and his supporters. Then in 1950, Eva was diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. She tried to fight the illness and was actually the first person in Argentina to have chemotherapy. But unfortunately, she died in July of 1952. It wasn't until 2011 that the truth came out. It was actually a neurosurgeon at Yale University who ended up viewing the X-ray scans of her body after her death. She had undergone a lobotomy, which could have happened anywhere between the day of her last public speech and the day of her death. A nurse who assisted in the procedure confirmed it. and said it was also done without Eva's consent and under high security. Now, there are two theories on this. One, it is that one ordered this procedure to help ease the pain of her cancer. Or two, one intended to alter her behavior. According to the nurse at the facility where it was performed, Eva stopped eating after the lobotomy, and it only made her death arrive quicker. The Kennedy family was famous for its large size and competitive nature, and from the outset, it was evident that Rosemary was different than her siblings. She underwent a difficult birth, which led to oxygen deprivation. Her development as an infant and a toddler were stunted as a result. She was held back in kindergarten twice. She was later sent to a private school, where she was tutored separately from other students. Her family was aware of her problems, but they did everything they could to keep Rosemary's condition private. As Rosemary grew older, her personality began to change. She developed a rebellious streak and began exhibiting mood swings, sometimes violently. She began to break rules at the private school where she was educated and housed, often leaving the campus at night. When Rosemary was only 23 years old, Joseph Kennedy worried about the potential public embarrassment. So he consulted a neurosurgeon about the relatively new procedure called the lobotomy. At that time, only 80 or so lobotomies had been performed in the United States. Joe Kennedy discussed the risks and benefits of a lobotomy with the doctors, but never consulted his wife. And without Rosemary's consent, he decided to have a lobotomy performed on her. The procedure was performed by Dr. James Watts and Dr. Walter Freeman. While Rosemary was under an anesthetic, she was asked to recite poetry, all while doctors cut directly into her brain. They continued until Rosemary was no longer to respond coherently, at which point they declared the operation complete. Rosemary left the operation table with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old and was immediately sent to a long-term care facility. And Joseph Kennedy went home and tried to explain it to his wife. For the rest of her life, Rosemary remained institutionalized. Her very public family did not discuss her condition. Her father never went to visit her in the institution. It took her mother 20 years to finally visit her. She never learned to speak clearly, but she was able to relearn how to walk with the use of a cane. Rosemary died in 2005. Many believe that she is part of the Kennedy curse, which has affected their family for centuries. And this is Rose Williams, the older sister of Tennessee Williams. Rose was a diagnosed schizophrenic and described by her brother as one of the most sweetest and genuine people he ever knew. In his memoirs, Tennessee notes that when Rose would go on a date, she would talk with the most hysterical animation, which few young men knew how to take. In 1926, Rose wrote a letter to her grandmother describing her depression. She said, "I don't know what's the matter with me. I was so nervous that I couldn't hold the glass to take my medicine. I stayed in bed all day and had a big dose of calomel. I feel better, but still weak. I just had finished a music lesson, and Miss Butel nearly drove me wild. It makes me nervous as a cat." By 1943, Rose was starting to lash out during manic episodes and agreed to undergo a frontal lobotomy. The procedure seemed to reduce Rose to an almost catatonic state. She remained institutionalized in a fancy institution thanks to her brother's fortune. In a post-surgery letter she wrote to Tennessee, she said, "I want some black coffee, ice cream on a chocolate bar, a good picture of you. Your devoted sister, XXX Rose. P.S. Send me $1 for ice cream." There could be thousands of women patients who had lobotomies that we don't even know about. This was a barbaric procedure mostly geared towards women, majorly without their consent, or they were pressured with the procedure. After 2,500 operations, Freeman performed his final ice pick lobotomy. It was on a housewife named Helen Mortensen in February of 1967. She died of a brain hemorrhage, and Freeman's career was finally over.